Hi there. Welcome to Infinite Stories. This is the podcast where we sit down and interview everyday people just like you and me. This is your host, Mitchell Vine, and boy, do we have an incredible story for you. Let's jump into this week's interview.
Rock and roll. All right, well, let's get it off. Who are you? Where are you from? How does your story start?
Yep. So, my name is Aaron Welty. I'm originally from Southeast Michigan. Grew up in Wayne, Westland, and Canton. Now I live and work in Washington, D.C. And as far as how does my story start? Well, my story starts 10 weeks earlier than anybody expected it to start. Because I was born 10 weeks premature in the early 80s. Now, being born 10 weeks premature in the early 80s, 40-something years ago, a little different than being born 10 weeks premature or even earlier today. In my case, I was essentially born with a death sentence hanging over me right from the get-go. Doctors did not expect me to survive. And if I did somehow miraculously survive, they told my parents that he will never walk on his own, never really be able to function on his own. He will be severely mentally challenged, mentally handicapped, and he's not going to amount to much. Their prognosis for me and their assessment of my quality of life was incredibly, incredibly low. One of the stories that's sort of part of the lore of my origin story is that the day I was born, they brought my mom into the hospital, and a couple of things happened. Number one, my grandmother, who was a nurse at that hospital, she was there as a patient at that time. And so my grandfather, my mom's dad, Grandpa Rex, goes up to her hospital room and says, "Hey, I know you're here as a patient, but your grandson's about to be born. So if you want to be there, you might need to get down there right now." And so she did. She came down there with her, IV pole and all that stuff, changed into scrubs kind of right in front of everybody, and was there for my mom. And once I was born, once I was out, I was immediately whisked away from my family by a group of medical professionals. And there's a few hours my dad has told me that the family really can't account for. Now, supposedly the story that happened in those few hours is I was taken to somewhere else in the hospital, and these doctors were going to decide my fate. They were going to decide what happened to me. And they really didn't think I was going to survive. They didn't necessarily think I was worth the effort. But there was a nurse in the room that day. There was a nurse in the room that day that worked with my grandmother, that was friends with my grandmother, that knew my family, that stepped in and said, "Hey, we know this kid's family. We know he's the first grandkid. You got to do everything you can." And so they did. And I believe that when she looked at me, she saw possibility and potential where all the doctors saw was a premature problem. And that was day one. And now it's, 42 times 365, however many days that is. A few years later, there's another story from when I was probably 3 or 4. I was in the hospital for something, and some of these doctors from back in the day, from the early days, kind of came across me, and they couldn't believe it was the same kid. They couldn't believe that I was still alive. because they, everything that they knew, everything that they thought told them that I was going to become a statistic, that I wasn't going to make it. And there was a doctor even that really early on, in the first few days after I made it through, the first couple of days, said to my parents, hey, you've got a decision to make. Are you going to distance yourself from this baby so that when he inevitably dies, your pain will be less? Or are you going to be willing to press in and literally love him to life? And as far as my parents were concerned, like, that decision was already made, right? When I talk to audiences, right, about the idea of weakness being heroic, and we can get into that a little bit later if you want, one of the things I talk about is the idea from the first Avengers movie of terrible privilege, right? Something that Iron Man says to Bruce Banner when they have this conversation in the helicarrier science lab. And the part of the way I process that idea of terrible privilege is that my parents understood and embraced the terrible privilege that my life was going to be. That they, whether we had language for it at the time or not, they embraced the idea that the heroic can emerge from the terrible, that purpose can arise like a phoenix from places of personal pain. And a lot of what I do today in terms of traveling and speaking and, speaking at camp, which is where you and I initially met years ago, flows from this idea of purpose arising like a phoenix from places of personal pain, and being able to take those more difficult parts of somebody's story, and, as I've heard you talk about in other episodes of the podcast, essentially find a redemptive thread or a redemptive narrative in the midst of all of that.
That's good. That's so good. So the whole growing up season of life for you, what did that look like as you were wrestling with this conflict, realistically? What was it like?
Well, so in some ways, growing up, it wasn't as much of a conflict as you might think.
Oh, really?
And then what I mean by that is that my parents did everything they could so that I could have as normal of a childhood as possible. Right? Like, even in school, like, I spent some time with, early on in my schooling, with students like myself, with medical and mobility challenges like myself. But I also spent time in kind of the mainstream space in elementary school. And then by the time I got to second grade and switched schools, I was in kind of normal, what you would consider, mainstream elementary education, all the way through. I went, to private school for junior high and part of high school, and then transitioned back to public school for the last couple of years of high school. And so in some ways, there wasn't a lot of struggle and conflict because, to borrow a line from a friend of mine from childhood, what do you mean we're using the handicap spot here at church? There's nobody here who's handicapped. Well, what about Aaron? Aaron's not handicapped. What are you talking about? So in a lot of the spaces that I inhabited, I mean, yes, there was the physical reality that things were a bit different for me. But when you look at the word disability and you break it down, right? Dis is a prefix, meaning, the opposite of the actual word it's attached to. So disability means a lack of ability or lack of capacity to do something. I didn't necessarily have that. I just maybe did it a little bit different. Um, Now, having said that, there was a, chunk of time in middle school where some of this more conflict that you're talking about did kind of raise its head. I did go through a period of time in middle school at this, private religious school that I went to where I was bullied. I was a target for a group of young middle school boys because it was a very small school. I was the only kid in the school with a walker with the kind of challenge that I have. So in some ways, I was very different than everyone else. I didn't personally think that was a problem, but some of these folks did. When I was also in middle school, I had a procedure done at a Shriners Hospital in Pennsylvania, and the recovery from the procedure went terribly wrong pretty early on, within 24 hours, if not less time. My digestive system began to shut down and turn itself off, and I began to waste away. And when I say waste away, I literally actually mean exactly that. If, there was a moment where I walked into the hospital, the bathroom attached to my hospital room, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and it was as if death was looking back at me, having stolen my face. So if you're familiar with a character like maybe Ko the Face Stealer from Avatar, right? It was kind of like that. And if you can imagine a scenario where Skeletor from He-Man and Locutus of Borg from Star Trek Next Generation, if you put them together, that's what I look like. My face was all sunken in and yellow, and I had tubes coming out everywhere. And that was kind of the moment where I realized, oh, this is bad. Like, this is serious. This is bad, right? And as a way to process it, we were talking earlier about Star Wars, as a way to mentally process it, because I had been watching, I had been and would continue during this time to watch Star Wars with my mom in the evenings on the TV, because they were running on USA at the time. It was near Christmas and all that stuff. And I thought, maybe this is what it felt like to be Luke Skywalker, being hunted, being pursued by Darth Vader down the Death Star trench in the original Star Wars. Like, I had my own inkling of what Luke must have been thinking and feeling, whether the story actually shows you or tells you that or not. And so, in that moment of just kind of dire reality, I was able to use my appreciation for Star Wars as a way to process this really awful thing that was happening to me. And that night, I was watching Star Wars with my mom. And Star Wars got over, and my mom said goodnight and left the room, went to go where she was staying in the hospital. And the nurse comes in. And right after Star Wars, Top Gun came on. And so I was really excited because I also love Top Gun. And the nurse turns off Top Gun, and I wasn't very happy about that. But then...
Shouldn't be.
Right? Shouldn't be. And so the nurse turns off Top Gun and does, all my vitals for the evening and leaves, and I'm completely alone in the hotel room. And everything just sort of crashed in on me mentally, emotionally, spiritually, right? And I cried myself to sleep, Mitch. I cried myself to sleep. And as I'm crying myself to sleep, the question that's going through my head is, God, am I going to die? Like, am I going to make it out of this? Am I going to make it home for Christmas? Am I going to see my family again? because I honestly didn't know. Like, because I'm just starting to wake up to the reality that if this situation that you're in doesn't get better, you will not make it out of here. But there was nothing I could do. And so I cried myself to sleep. And I normally don't tell this part of the story because it tends to be kind of not only kind of nebulous and foreign, but also heavy for a lot of audiences. But you had, in some of the conversation we were having prior to recording, this came up. And so I cry myself to sleep. And what happened next, to this day, 20-something years later, I don't know if what happened next was a dream or reality. But I've accepted it. And what happened next is, let's say for the sake of argument, I dreamt this. In the dream, I wake up expecting to be alone in my hospital room. In the dream, I was not. I saw at the end of my bed 2 figures, very big, one light and wings and all that stuff, one dark and wings and fiery and purple and because of my growing up with things like Frank Peretti spiritual warfare novels about angels and demons and humans and towns in the balance and growing up with things like Archangel comic books, which are still to this day my favorite comic books ever, and they're like the holy grail of parts of my like fandom collection, because of being exposed to all these things and inundated to all these things, I think that may have affected either what I dreamt or what I saw. And so what I saw was not wholly unfamiliar to me. I understood that I was seeing a representation of all that is good and light and wonderful, and a representation of all that is not. And they began to like wrestle and grapple and sword fight at the end of my bed. And I had just this indication that like the outcome of what I'm seeing or dreaming may in fact affect the outcome of what happens to me. And from what I remember, right, the being of light and all of that very well could have been an angel, won that fight, won that match or whatever you want to call it. And the other entity, the other thing kind of went flying out of the window, the hospital room window. And, still small voice says, you're going to make it. It's not going to be easy, but you're going to make it. And it wasn't easy. I mean, I was in the hospital, 2-3 weeks all told. I couldn't eat anything for like 7 to 10 days. All that I was allowed to consume was the ice chips that my mom fed me. To this day, I cannot consume crushed ice. Like if you give me a drink with crushed ice, like if I'm somewhere and they somehow give me a drink with crushed ice, like I'm like, sorry, if you're gonna put ice in it, it's got to be cubes. Like I can't. I know it's weird, but like I can't do it. Yeah, and it's a really crazy, intense thing to go through at a very young age. And so, but it has influenced and shaped how I see the world. Like it has influenced my understanding of like perseverance and pain and suffering and, you know, things that we don't really like to talk about because they're not fun and they're not happy and they're not kind of, picturesque representations of success and the American dream and those kind of things. And they're hard, difficult things. And it was just another one of those things that kind of set me apart from my peers, particularly at school, right? Because nobody else had really gone through something like that. Fortunately, the church space I grew up in, where at one point there was 4 generations of my mom's family all together, that space was an excellent space for me to grow up in. They were very understanding, very accepting. I had a great group of friends from church and youth group, and like my best friend and I, 30 something years later, we're still best friends. I was in his wedding, the whole thing. I go back and visit him and his wife and his kids and whatnot, flew back to Southeast Michigan back in the spring when their kids got baptized, that whole thing. So, there were kind of points in terms of conflict, but one of the things that was very helpful, I talked a little bit about how, my parents did everything they could for me to have as normal a childhood as possible. And all things considered, I had a pretty, normal childhood, or what I consider a normal childhood. But one of the things that really contributed to that, and we were talking about this a little bit in a roundabout way at the beginning, is camp, right? Camp for me, the way I describe camp now in my, as somebody who gets to go back and contribute and invest a couple weeks every year, the way I describe camp is where Narnia meets Cheers, right? Camp is like my
yes.
right? Narnia meets Cheers. And part of that, the Cheers part, it's not an original like wealthy verse observation. It's actually something I picked up from a conversation I had with Ken Rudolph about 6-7 months ago when I was at their house in North Carolina. We were talking about camp and we were talking about some stuff and just my love and affinity for camp. And Ken just looks at me and says, "Welty, camp is your version of Cheers. It's where everybody knows you. And it's like your safe space." And I was like, yeah. And part of the reason that camp is what it is to me is because when I first started going to Lake Ann in the late 90s, junior high school, camp was a place that never said no. They never said no. They never said never. They never said shouldn't. They always asked how, right? They always asked, okay, Welty wants to do this. Like, Welty wants to play paintball. Welty wants to climb the tower. Welty wants to do high ropes. Welty wants to do, Jacob's ladder, because back in 1999, in the very first, Reborn Rangers program, and I'm actually wearing the shirt from this year right now, we were the guinea pigs for Jacob's ladder. And so the question was always, how does Welty do a thing? How does he be involved? What do we have to do? In some cases, maybe what rules or guidelines do we have to bend a little bit so he can do some stuff? Like Jacob's ladder, for example. When I did Jacob's ladder 25 years ago, I got up as high as I could go, right? And I couldn't get all the way to the top because of balance issues, right? I tried to go up, one more or whatever, and I couldn't. My legs couldn't do it. And so the guys at the bottom holding the ladder steady, they called up to me and they said, "Hey, Welty, we got an idea." Okay. They said, "Just hang on and raise your hand up when we tell you." I was like, okay. And so these three or four guys at the bottom, they grabbed the ladder and they lifted it up. Like, I mean,
I pictured it so clearly.
right. They lifted it up, and then I was able to put my hand up and ring the bell and all that stuff. And everybody went, we were all really happy and all that. Well, all these years later, 5 years ago, in 2019, when I was helping to direct the program, we were having this conversation with the students about some of my experiences at camp and high adventure and stuff, and talking about this idea that we're talking about right now about camp always asked, how can I be involved? How can I contribute? And I told that story about Jacob's Ladder, and one of the recruits, Reborn Ranger recruits, was like, "Wait a minute. You're the reason that there's a rule for Jacob's Ladder that you can't do that?" And I looked at this guy. I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "There's a rule that you can't do that." I was like, "Wait a minute. There's a high adventure rule because of me?" And they were like, "Yeah." I was like,
yes.
I was like, "That's peak that's peak camp achievement, man." Like it doesn't get much better than like, "Yeah, there's a rule because of you." Things that like you can't do anymore because you did it. It's amazing. It's just amazing. I mean,
That is incredible.
Even a dozen years ago when I came back to camp for the first time to speak in 2012, that's back when they were doing the leap as part of Reborn, and I'd never done the leap before. The leap was brand new back then, and so the entire company gets done. And back then, Chris Howard was directing the program, and like I had said to Chris, I said, "Hey, Chris, if there's time, can I do this?" And Chris looks at me and says, "Well, the program director in me says, probably not, because there might not be time. But the youth pastor in me says, absolutely, heck yes, you need to do this because these students need to see you do it." And so we got done, and Chris just looks at me and says, "You ready?" And looks at everybody else and says, "Okay, so there's one more Reborn Ranger that needs to go." And they put me in a harness, put me in a helmet, hook me in, all that safety stuff that we always got to do, and we do so well. And I started up the leap, and I got about a third of the way up, and the pegs got smaller, and they got harder, and I realized my feet weren't going to be all that much use, and so I had to literally pull myself up by my upper body, and then up at the top. Normally you don't do this, but in my case, they were like, we're going to let this happen. They actually put one of the counselors up there to help me get on the platform and then help position me. And so if we were positioned the way we are right now, you would be where you are, I'd be where I am, you would be holding my hand and kind of being the singular thing that's keeping me in place. And then we counted it down 3, 2, 1. And I basically did like a, Superman Dark Knight Returns kind of free fall. Because normally they try and jump off. I was like, nah, I'm just going to Superman free fall this thing. And I went from a Superman free fall to a Spider-Man pose on the way down and stuff. And I was exhausted by the end. Absolutely exhausted. Face down on the ground in the leaves. And as I'm there and my body's trying to catch up to the rest of me and what I just did to myself, I'll never forget it. There were a couple of Ranger recruits who came over to me and just knelt down next to me. I looked like I was half dead, facing the ground. And they were just like, that's the most amazing, life-changing thing we've ever seen. And like one of them, a dozen years later, she's married now, um, has a couple kids. Like she and I still talk every once in a while on Facebook. And, I found out that, her dad was actually he's like an album cover artist and did a bunch of album covers, for the band Rush, which I love, and got to go see them for their 40th anniversary tour almost 10 years ago. And so part of how this all comes together in terms of childhood is just as much as my parents were a great influence in how I grew up and what I discovered I was capable of. Camp was, just as much a part of that as well.
Mm,
The
that's amazing. And like the effects of that is still going on to this day.
Oh, I mean, here a great example of this is so. When I talked at the beginning about how I was born 10 weeks premature, years later, so one of the families I grew up with, um, like, you know, where like my parents and their parents are friends, and we as kids grew up together. There's a young lady I grew up with who, would go on and would get married and have a family of her own. And her oldest uh, would be born premature, not at 30 weeks, but at 26, right? 26 weeks. Um, she's either nearing or she's nearing the end of high school now. And for the first time ever, she is actually at camp at Lake Ann right now. Like as you and I are talking, she is at Lake Ann for the last week of camp on senior high. She's never done anything like that before. And it just so happens that her counselor is somebody who went through Reborn with myself and the program team 3 years ago and has now counseled multiple summers, who is, this young lady's counselor. And there's a couple of Reborn Rangers from this summer that I just got to, spend time investing in this summer that are on her senior high team and stuff. And apparently when they arrived at camp, because I've been getting like daily reports from some folks, apparently when they arrived at camp, like one of the first things they did was like, they name dropped me, and they were like, well, so we know Welty, and our daughter has the same kind of challenge that Welty's got, and all that stuff. And I'm sure there was a conversation with their counselor about all that, and she was like, I know Welty probably better than you guys do. So like when you're talking about how there's still kind of ripples of all of that and how camp has influenced me, and all that is kind of coming together to influence somebody who, with my same challenges, who is at camp right now. That's just kind of, and that's all coming together, live and in real time, just in the last couple of days. But when you ask about the challenge and the conflict, I would say that kind of conflict is actually shown up more in my adult life than it did when I was a kid. When I went to college,
How so?
when I went to college at Cedarville, graduated almost 20 years ago. During my sophomore year, like college at Cedarville was very tough for me. It was tough for me mentally. It was tough for me academically. At times it was very tough spiritually. It was tough emotionally, and it was particularly difficult physically because I had to kind of elevate my life in order to keep up with the pace of college. And my body didn't like that. And so my body the way my body would interpret that kind of elevated energy expenditure and that kind of stress is physical arthritic pain. So I was in pain a lot. And it got to be really bad during my winter of my sophomore year. And so there was this moment during winter of my sophomore year, a couple of nights, where I was up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning, hunched over my desk chair, just praying and begging God, I need you to take this away. I need you to heal me. I need you to fix this. God very clearly said no. You know, the way I think of it in my like geeky fandom brain is that I hear God saying that in the voice of Dr. Alan Grant from the original Jurassic Park when, Tim and Lex, right? They're freaking out and Tim and Lex are like, he left us, the blood-sucking lawyer, he left us. And Dr. Grant says, that's not what I'm going to do. Like, that's what I heard, right? God saying, that's not what I'm going to do. And he didn't. I mean, 20 something years later, I still have cerebral palsy. But what's interesting is, and there are multiple pieces to this, but, God didn't heal me. But what he did instead was he pointed me to, 2 Corinthians 12 and Paul and the whole him writing about the thorn in the flesh and asking God 3 times to heal him. And God said no. And the whole idea of Paul writing about how God's power being made perfect in weakness. And sometimes things like that, we don't understand them. We don't engage with them unless we have to live them, right? And that understanding has gone on to influence like how I see things, what I speak about, how I speak about it. Because when I talk about weakness being heroic, 2 Corinthians 12 is one of the places that I talk about, in addition to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and the jars of clay passage, about how we're hard pressed on every side but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. And so God didn't heal me. And essentially said, instead, I'm going to do for you the same thing I did for Paul. The prescription I'm going to give you is not physical healing, it's perseverance. Right? I'm going to make you stronger, right? Better, stronger, faster, higher, faster, further, more. And in the last 20 something years, that's kind of the space I've had to learn to live in and to live out of. And when I think about one of the most dangerous phrases, in my opinion, in all of Scripture is in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 3, right? We know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we love it. We love it for the radical rescue. We love it for the fact that they were rescued from the fiery furnace. Some of us love it because part of the way we processed it was the story of Rack Shack and Benny and VeggieTales and the Bunny Song in the 90s and early 2000s, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like, sometimes I still sing the Bunny Song because I think it's funny. And so we know the story, but one of the things we often skip over in the story is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to the king, we believe that our God's going to show up, show off, and rescue us from your hand. But even if he does not, or as some translations say, but if not, we will still not bow down to your statue, your 90-foot golden statue. And I always add that if there was a welty verse translation, it would be, we're not going to bow down to your 90-foot golden statue that is basically substituting for your ego. And they didn't. And so they get tossed into the fire. One of the interesting details to me about that is they get tossed into the fire that has been heated 7 times hotter than normal. To the point where, according to the text, the guys who threw them in got burned alive. It was so hot. So, yes, there's a radical rescue, and there's the, 4th one in the fire with them, the one who looks like the son of the gods. Hang on just a second. I'm going to plug in my laptop here. The one who looks like the son of the gods, and they come out, they are not singed and all that. We love that part of it, but we don't process it in a way where we understand that these 3 guys, they were willing to accept that God might not show up the way that they wanted him to, the way that they thought that they needed him to. And he did. He showed up. But he showed up in a way where they had to persevere through the thing. They weren't protected from it in a preventative way like we like to think, where, God did something awesome and it didn't happen, and they didn't even end up in the fire. 3 chapters later in Daniel 6, it happens to Daniel, but it's lions and not a fire. He's preserved, he's protected, but he still has to go in. And so that has also greatly influenced my understanding of perseverance versus preventative protection, right? Whereas I've had to persevere through far more in life, as opposed to God saying, I'm going to prevent this, or I'm going to fix this. I'm not saying God doesn't do that. I mean, my personal view on God showing up and showing off his healing is God can, God does, but not always. And I'm one of those but not always situations. At least, this side of space-time, right? This side of eternity. And so what I've realized over time in the 20-something years since that experience at Cedarville is that I wanted God to wave his hand like a Jedi mind trick, take everything away, because I wanted him to prescribe painlessness for me. And ultimately, I think the deeper thing is, God was saying, yes, I'm not going to heal you. It's not what I'm going to do. But what you really want me to do is to prescribe painlessness for you, and I'm not going to do that either. Like, that's what I'm really not going to do. And when we talk about, God showing up and showing off and healing, there's also a question of, what do you want him to do versus what do you need him to do, right? Tony Stark is a good example. Tony Stark goes through all this horrible stuff, and he learns this deep lesson about terrible privilege by the time you get to the Avengers film. And then in the film right after this, in Iron Man 3, ultimately, he experiences physical healing. The shrapnel gets pulled from his chest. He experiences biological repair, which is most of the time when we talk about healing, that's what we're talking about. We want God to biologically or emotionally or psychologically repair something. And that's not bad. Like, I'm not saying that's bad or evil. It's not. I mean, it was a good thing for me to ask for that. And sometimes I still ask for that. And I have friends who regularly pray that for me, even though they know all these pieces of the story. But I think on a deeper level, it's more of a Stephen Strange situation. It's more of, Stephen Strange gets in and I'm just going to go off of what we know from the movies, right? Because that's easier. Gets in the car accident, loses use of his hands. He's not this rich award-winning surgeon anymore. He loses his ability to heal people, and he desperately wants to be healed or thinks he needs to be healed himself. And he goes to Kamartaj. He meets the Ancient One. He begins studying under the Ancient One's tutelage, right, to become the Sorcerer Supreme. But the issue with his hands is never resolved. It's never fixed. It's why he wears the yellow gloves, so you don't see his hands shaking all the time. Because they're still what they were. But the thing about Stephen Strange is he experiences healing of the soul. He experiences something deeper than biological repair. Because the shrapnel that exists in his soul from what happens, that's actually a little more like physically depicted in what happens to Tony Stark. That shrapnel is ultimately what is removed from his soul over the course of the first Doctor Strange movie, when he finally learns the lesson from the Ancient One. It's not about you. It's not about what you want. And learning that it's not about you is the greatest lesson, the most important lesson of all. And so even when we talk about healing, one of the things that's important, I think, to kind of differentiate on is, what kind of healing are we talking about? What do you want versus what do you need? What kind of healing do you want? And maybe that's physical. Versus what's the kind of healing of the heart, healing of the soul, the kind of deeper spiritual healing that you actually need. And I had an experience almost 10 years ago. I was with my dad and a group of folks from my church here in DC, and we were all together in Israel, right? It's not easy to go to Israel today, right now, with what's happening in that area of the world, but we're in Israel. It's our last day in Israel. We're in Jerusalem. We're in the old city. And I can tell you, as somebody with medical and mobility challenges, even with a walker, it's really tough to get around the old city of Jerusalem. Tough to get around Israel, period. Did it, but it's hard. And it's the last day in Israel, and my dad and I are walking around the old city, and my dad goes off to buy a shirt for my brother, like an Israeli Air Force shirt for my brother. And as my dad walks off, all of a sudden, I'm surrounded by a very young, energetic, dare I say, charismatic group of American college kids. And they asked me the question I've heard so many times before. Hey, what's going on here? Can we pray for you? Right? And in my experience, sometimes somebody who doesn't really know you asks to pray for you, what they're really saying is, can we pray healing for you? Right? Because they saw the walker, Automatically, the assumption is, something's wrong here. Let's step in. We can be involved in resolving and fixing this thing, so on and so forth. And so I kind of knew what I was stepping into. And so I said yes. And so they start to pray. And pretty soon, whatever it is they're praying, I can't understand. And so what goes through my head is, okay, this is no nerd language I've ever heard. It's not Ewok, it's not Elvish, it's not Klingon, you know. Maybe this is what, kind of, prayer language and praying in the spirit kind of thing. Maybe that's what this is. And so I just let it continue. And then they stop. They stop and they ask me, so how do you feel now? Well, what do you mean? Like your legs, do they feel any different? No. And so they start up again. And at this point, my dad is back. He's on the outside of the circle, doesn't really know what's going on, is trying to make his way in to the circle towards me. And he told me all this later, right? Because my head's bowed, my eyes are closed. And so they keep praying, and I'm just having this conversation with God in the middle of all this. And I'm like, God, this is getting really weird and awkward. I don't know what to do. And the Holy Spirit says to me, Welty, they are trying to pray a degree of peace into your life through physical healing that they don't understand you already have. Because you've spent decades since college fighting for it, right? And of course, in my brain, I'm going back to that moment in college when I asked God to heal me, and God said no. This was probably, I don't know, 15 years later, maybe. And he says, tell them that. Okay. So they stop. They ask again, how do you feel? How are your legs? I said, I don't feel any different. And they kind of looked at me weird. And I said, well, hey, I understand what you're doing and I appreciate it, but I'm okay. Like, I'm at peace with this. And I tried to begin to tell them that and share with them a little bit of that journey that I'd been on for, since I was 20. At this point, I was probably early mid 30s, and they didn't really want to hear that. Next thing I knew, they kind of dispersed and kind of disappeared. Didn't really see them again. And I spent a long time, since then, kind of processing this, talking about it with my dad, talking about it with a couple of pastor friends, from my church after I got back from this trip. And, they were like, yeah, we already heard about what happened, so on and so forth. And so, part of what I've come to and understanding that is that this group of college kids, they saw the opportunity for a miracle and they wanted to be a part of it. And when the miracle that they were looking for didn't happen, they disappeared. Now, I would actually submit to you that they saw a miracle that day, but it just wasn't the one that they were looking for, right? What they saw was a miracle of peace, of perseverance, of peace in the midst of the situation, even though what they were looking for was a little more physical in nature, and that didn't happen. What they actually were exposed to, I believe, in being exposed to a miracle of perseverance, is they were exposed to a greater miracle, but because it wasn't what they were looking for, they missed it.
That's so normal for the human race, sadly, isn't it?
You know?
Oh man, my heart kind of breaks for them. Like, I mean, I've been there as well. Definitely not to the same degree, but like expecting miracles in some way that it's preconceived on my end, and if it doesn't
Hmm.
happen the exact same way that I want it to happen, God can't get glory from that. When in
Right.
reality, He gets the final say on what He gets glory from.
Right. I mean,
Oh
even
man.
even when you're talking about things not going kind of the way you want, right? I'm, I'm 42 years old. I've been in Washington D.C. living and working almost 20 years. This fall it'll be 19 years. Just as much time as I spent in Michigan growing up. I've now, pretty much spent here living and working in D.C. And in my 20s, I was working on Capitol Hill and national politics and all that, and involved in that world. And I thought that that world was going to be my whole life for the rest of my life. It didn't turn out that way. Um, now I have a back office government job here in DC. Um, and if you had known me in my 20s and you had asked me, Welty, what do you think life's going to be like when you're 40 or in your 40s? And I was honest with you, more importantly, if I was honest with myself, I would have said um, a few things. I would have said politics, policy, power, promotion, and maybe as a fifth thing, maybe a partner, maybe a life partner to kind of keep the alliteration going. If you had asked me that same question in my 30s and I had been honest with you and I had been honest with myself, I would have said a few things. I would have said publishing, platform, profit, and again, maybe partner. Mitch, I'm 42 and, I'm not married, don't have kids or family of my own. I'm okay with that. God, seeks to change that, and He might. Um, that's great. But all of those things that I had hoped for that my life would look like by the time I was in my 40s, God didn't say yes to any of that, or at least didn't say yes to any of that to the degree that I had hoped. Yes, I had this dream of going to Washington and working on Capitol Hill. Yes, I did get to do that for the better part of 7 years, but it never went where I wanted it to go. Um, it never went to a place where like I actually got to be high up in an office or like be a member of Congress myself, or, heaven forbid, be the president of the United States. Because when I was a teenager climbing the tower at Lake Ann and I, wrote my name up at the top of the tower all those years ago as like a 15, 16-year-old, the story Ken Riley always tells is how I wrote like, 50th president of the United States or something like that. Because back then I thought maybe I could be president, and that was what I was hoping for. I've wised up since then. But so much of where we expect life to go and how we want life to turn out, that might not be what God has for us. And, looking at it now, I mean, I still wrestle with that, right? I still wrestle with that from the point of view of, okay, if I wanted all these things in my 20s and 30s and none of them happened because God said no, and that's not what He wants from me, wrestling with this reality of, why do I want this stuff that God seems to not want for me, right? Like, why am I the problem? Am I the problem? Like, how do we fix this? And I don't necessarily have a concrete answer for you other than the best answer I can give you, and it's an answer that a buddy of mine and I have talked about together for probably 5, 6, 7 years now, is it's a battle. It's a tension between unmet expectations versus sanctified expectations. Unmet expectations versus sanctified expectations. And then the question of, okay, if you have these expectations and they go unmet, either how do you let them go, or how do you turn them into sanctified expectations? That is kind of the tension. That is the challenge on a more like kind of mental, spiritual, psychological, emotional level. Kind of in my life is what do I do with my expectations? How do I manage them? How do I, like I said, let the ones go that, aren't ones that I should have or aren't for me? And, how do I find a way to sanctify what's left? Right? Part of the way I look at it is, if I was still on Capitol Hill today and I was, a member of Congress, or I was, a chief of staff for a member of Congress or a senator, I wouldn't have time to take 2 weeks to be at Lake Anna every summer. Life wouldn't allow for that. And those 2 weeks are the most important 2 weeks of my year, right? The most important 2 weeks of my year that I prepare for all year round. I train for, like physically, I train for it so that I have the capacity to, be able to physically keep up with, those kinds of things. And like, even some of these expectations, right? Some of the more relational ones, I think I might know, what God's gonna do. And you work towards that, even some of these occupational expectations, but there's no guarantee, right? And so you walk forward as best you can, day after day, doing your best to be obedient to what, to what God tells you. And sometimes that's hard. And that's where kind of that phrase from Lando Calrissian from Solo that I mentioned earlier about, I don't like it, I don't agree with it, but I accept it. A lot of what, God seems to be doing these last few years, 6, 7 years, kind of in my life and kind of around me, a lot of it I don't like. Some of it I don't agree with. I don't agree with the fact that, some of my closest friends and family have passed away in the last 4 or 5 years. People that were involved with dreams that I had and hopes that I had and things that I wanted to do, that now today, if they still happen, they won't happen the same way, because that person or people or persons, they're not here to be a part of that, to enjoy that with me, to, expected to be in a different place occupationally, by this time in my life and career. But as I said, if I was, I wouldn't have the margin to invest in Reborn Ranger students and campers and um, counselors and stuff, I wouldn't have the opportunity to, show up and surprise folks for, graduations from college and, um, graduation parties and crashing like camp reunions and hosting camp reunions. And at the end of the day, one of the things my pastor says is that he personally defines the idea of success as success is succession. Success is about who you're investing in, right? Who you're investing in and how that investment is influencing those you're investing in and how that investment is ultimately going to influence the generation that comes after you. And so that's a lot of what camp every summer is for me. It's an opportunity to invest in a new company of recruits. It's an opportunity to continue to invest in Reborn Rangers that become counselors, and even beyond, after they've, maybe they're not counseling at camp anymore, and ultimately, I think that that's kind of more of where life is headed for me, where I get to spend more time doing that kind of stuff instead of being caught up in the DC rat race, where so much of who you are, it's expected that so much of who you are, so much of your identity is tied up in your occupation. It's tied up in your work, in your title, in your network of influence, and how much money you make, all this stuff. And there was a conversation I had on a podcast with a good buddy of mine a few months ago, a guy named Randy Newman. He used to do a podcast for the C.S. Lewis Institute. Unfortunately, he passed away suddenly a couple of months ago. And we were on this podcast together, and I was talking about kind of my life and different things and different ideas. And I was talking about the idea that weakness can be heroic. And he made this observation about me, about how when it comes to how I process and filter identity, the challenges that I have medically and mobility wise, like that's even not, that's not first order for my identity. That's not even, second order for my identity. And we were talking about how more of my identity stems from, not only identity in Christ as the thing of being, the thing of first order, not to be confused with the first order. Two very different things. Right? Two very different things. One is,
I knew you were going to go there. I knew
right,
it. I saw
right.
it a mile away.
One is of course, primary mode and filter for identity as those of those who follow Jesus, and the second being, second generation space fascism. Two very different things. But he mentioned how in what he understands of me, having known me for a number of years and being a real good friend of mine, that even, my love for fandom and superheroes and Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and that kind of stuff is a higher mode and higher order of identity than the physical and medical and mobility challenges that I have. And so like work identity, quote unquote, is even lower than that. And yet I live in a town that is very transient and very transactional and is very much kind of framed and forged and built on this idea that a majority of your identity is your work. And yet, I've gotten to a place where I've kind of rejected that and said, no, it isn't. I would much rather be known for these other things. that I think are way more fun.
100 times more fun.
Oh yeah.
Well, I feel like I need to ask a question because I don't know you've spoken a lot about the overcoming of a lot of your life and a lot of the
Hmm.
events and different things that you have been uh, capable of overcoming. But I guess my question would be a lot of Christians talk about having like an aha moment with salvation or like a gospel moment with redemption. Do you have one single moment, or was it something that happened over time? What did that look like for you?
Well, I would say a few things. There's kind of the classic moment as a kid where you come to faith in Jesus, right? I was like 6, 7 years old. Um, I remember that day. It was a Sunday morning. So I think it was Sunday school. Um, I remember that day. I remember what I was wearing that day. It was kind of this Easter-ish outfit. Um, sweater and stuff, like pastel colors. Um, I remember who was involved in that moment. My Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Allen, um, who I still was very much connected to for a number of years after that, and still kind of keep tabs on through social media these days and all of that. And I I kind of look at it two ways, right? At that time, I gave all of what I understood of me to all of what I understood, what and who I understood Jesus to be. I knew I needed Jesus. I didn't necessarily know all of like the finer theological points and reasons and all that stuff, but I knew this was important. As I got older, I began to grapple with the fact that, oh my gosh, all of the stuff that I went through as a young kid prior to that moment, where like I should not have lived, I should not have survived. And the idea that, again, going back to that preservation and perseverance versus prevention thing, God didn't prevent those things from happening, but He did preserve me. He did enable me to persevere even as a young kid so I could get to that point where a decision could be made. Now, that's the kind of thing that often gets pointed to as like a singular moment. But I think that, you know, redemptive wise, like, I mean, I've been thinking about now where, I'm traveling the country, um, a few times a year, going to camp, and just the redemptive narrative that exists in that space where I've now been able to, I'm in a place where I can take a lifetime of perseverance. I can take a lifetime of um, preservation. And I can take a lifetime of story, not just my own, but these other heroic journey type stories that I love, and bring them all together to speak to some things that a lot of folks can't or won't because they're they're hard. Um, they're hard and they're not happy. They're not happy things, right? And my kind of the threefold filter that I use when I speak and when I write is I have three questions. Number one, is it helpful? Number two, is it hopeful? Number three, is it honest? And if I can successfully answer yes to all three of those questions in a way that's relatively balanced, I know I'm on the right track. Because I can say something that's honest, that isn't helpful or hopeful, and actually ends up being hurtful. I can say something that's hopeful and helpful, but it's not honest. And that dishonesty ends up being more hurtful than helpful. And maybe you kind of dial back some of that honesty in hope of injecting a little more happiness. But, happiness isn't part of the Triforce here. Like, it's helpful, hopeful, and honest. Not saying that happiness is a bad thing, and not saying that happiness is worthwhile. But as I talk about when I talk about the idea of pursuing heroic ending versus chasing the happy ending, I think that the heroic is more worthwhile than the happy, especially when we look at how it plays out in like stories and TV and movies and those kind of things. But even when it comes to, more of a happy ending, and when I talk at camp, I talk about this, my view of a lot of that is, in a nutshell, is pursue an ending that's heroic. Do the heroic thing. Do the thing that allows you to facilitate redemptive good for somebody else, even if it might cost you something. Do the heroic thing. Pursue heroic ending, like we see Luke Skywalker do, like we see Frodo Baggins do, like we see Batman do, like we see Wonder Woman do, and Katniss Everdeen and Buffy Summers and Harry Potter, and we see Aslan do that, and we see Jesus do that in the Gospels. Pursue a heroic ending, and you might get happy ending thrown in. Pursue heroic ending, and you might get happy ending thrown in. And if that sounds familiar, it's because I'm echoing something that C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity about how aim for heaven and you might get earth thrown in, but aim for earth and you'll probably get neither. And so my thought is pursue a heroic ending and you might get happiness thrown in, but chase a happy ending or what you to believe to be a happy ending and you'll probably get neither.
Man, that's so good. I know you're a movie guy, so my next question should be pretty easy for you.
Yeah.
If you could have a movie made about your life, what would you want it to be called?
It would probably be called the same thing that hopefully someday the book that I've been working on for 20 years will be called. And that the title, the working title for that book is Borrowed Time. The subtitle may or may not end up being someday A Life of Holy Recklessness. We'll see.
I love that.
We'll see about that part.
That's so good. Yeah. Well, I'll cross my fingers on your behalf
Yeah.
because I would
Yeah.
read that
Yeah.
100%. Maybe I could even help make the movie. I think that'd be a great team up. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Oh
And
man.
I've actually there's
Oh man. So
there's a guy out in Hollywood who's a movie producer. Haven't seen him in years, but we would cross paths from time to time when I worked on Capitol Hill. He actually asked me once, why there hasn't been a movie made of my life. So, maybe someday, who knows?
hey, let's get that cracked, and Jesus could come back at any minute, so we don't want to waste time.
I think the book's got to probably be finished first.
Okay, all right, good call, good
Yeah.
call. Oh man, so as we're kind of wrapping up the interview as a whole, what would you say to someone who is scared or maybe intimidated in sharing their story? How would you encourage them?
In a in a nutshell, I would say yes. I would say do it anyway. And here's what I mean. About a dozen years ago, a couple months before I turned 30, while I was still working on Capitol Hill, I was asked to go visit a hospital in the congressional district that I worked for, because I had worked with this hospital for a number of years to prevent a federal government agency in DC, to prevent them from shutting down a program that the hospital ran. It was a program focused on kind of family medicine and training family medicine doctors and that kind of thing. And this organization in DC that had, given them some seed money a number of years before wanted to shut things down. And I helped prevent that. And so the hospital said, hey, come and talk with our program leads and our students and kind of tell the story. I said, great. So I'm with them in a conference room at this hospital, sharing the story. And part of that conversation turned toward some of my origin story that I'm sharing with you today. And as I'm sharing the origin story, I happen to tell this room full of medical professionals, or soon-to-be medical professionals, that this was the hospital that I was born in, the hospital I was talking about at the beginning of our interview. The entire room went dead silent. Absolutely dead silent. And as we're leaving, the doctor who had been running this meeting comes to me and says, hey, Aaron, do you want to go see where you were born? Mitch, I was terrified. I was terrified. I was so scared. But I knew I needed to say yes. I knew I needed to say yes. And it was only recently that I realized that moment, stepping into that moment, that was a Dagobah cave moment for me. Right? And Luke Skywalker asks Yoda about the cave, and Yoda says, in you must go. It was actually, I put that all together just a few days ago in real time when I was doing that interview for the Star Wars podcast. So you almost literally saw the light bulb go on in the middle of the recording. But I said yes. I said yes to this thing that terrified me. And so we walked down the hall. The doctor opens these double doors down the hallway, and we stepped into an area of the hospital that had not yet been remodeled. A bunch of the hospital had been remodeled in the intervening time. This area hadn't, which meant that it still looked the way it would have looked the day that I was born. Okay? In fantastical terms, in fantastical fandom terms, this means that I literally got to time travel, that I literally got to walk into my own past. I did not need a DeLorean. I did not need a flux capacitor. I didn't need a TARDIS. I didn't even need an ocarina of time, man. And I literally walked into my own past. And I walked down the hallway with this doctor. And at this point, there's this whole gaggle of people from the meeting that are following us because they know something important is about to happen. And the hospital photographer documented the whole thing and got pictures and stuff. And so he walks me down to the end of the hall, opens this door to this operating theater that would have been the room that I was born in, almost 30 years before, and says, step inside. I step inside, and Mitch, it took everything I had to not fall apart. It took everything I had to keep it together like the Millennium Falcon, right? She'll hold together. Come on, baby, hold together. Like, that's what I felt like. Because all I wanted to do was cry. I wanted to cry at like God's faithfulness to me up to that point. But I also wanted to cry because everything that I would go through, everything that I would be preserved through and persevere through started in that room. Even to today, 12 years later after that experience, everything started in that room in a hospital they almost never made it out of. So all of that to say, if somebody is scared, afraid, and terrified to share their story, say yes and do it anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, then, technically, I only have one last question, and then you're
Yeah.
scot free. Is there anything else that you sense the Holy Spirit wants you to share for on behalf of anybody who will listen to this podcast?
Um, and I'm gonna do this because this is proof that I'm getting better at this part of this space, and because I'm never really great at this, but I want to make sure that for folks who listen to this, who see this, that if they're interested, that they know how to find me, right? Whether they want to talk more, whether they have questions, whether they're interested in having me come speak somewhere, and kind of figuring that out and facilitating it. Obviously, my Instagram handle is right here. It's at Aaron Welty, and Instagram is a way that you can get a hold of me. But the best way is my email address, which is Aaron, Aaron, at aaronrwelty.com. That's aaronrwelty.com, because that's my speaking website. And at the website, aaronrwelty.com, there's a way to contact me. There's my speaking demo that I put together. So if folks hear this, they see this, they're interested, that's a great way to get a hold of me. And I would say the other thing I would say is it's okay if life is hard, right? It's especially kind of living here in America in the West as believers, and depending on how plugged in folks are into like Christian subculture and stuff. We want to have kind of this idyllic kind of life that's a combination of like Jesus and the American dream. It's okay if your life isn't that. It's okay if your life is challenging. It's okay if life is hard. Because chances are God's trying to build something in you, right? God's trying to build you better, stronger, faster, higher, further, faster, more. But I recognize that it's hard because what we want is ease. What we want is convenience. The reality is, and some of us I think are better at this than others based on what we've gone through, is we need to wrestle with the idea of an ethic of suffering, theology of pain, that understands that pain has a purpose, a place, is a part of life. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's comfortable. It's not any of those things. Because for some folks who listen to this, they're going to hear some of this and they're going to hear parts and pieces of this story and they're going to be like, not today. It's not for today. And for them, it might not be for today. But perhaps an episode like this isn't for them today. It's for their future self. It's for the version of them, 5 to 10 years from now, when the thing happens that levels up their life and their life becomes harder. And that's when God taps them on the shoulder and says, hey, you remember that episode with Mitch and Welty that you listened to, that you watched, and you didn't really understand some of what they were talking about, and it felt way over your head? That's for today. That's for now. And that's, for me, as somebody who, is an occasional podcast guest on a podcast or goes and speaks somewhere, that's one of the toughest challenges for me as a speaker, is recognizing what I just told you about somebody else's life and being able to trust that moment that the light bulb comes on for them, I probably won't be there for it. I won't be there to shepherd it. I won't be there to facilitate it. I won't be there to encourage it. But I got to trust that it's going to happen anyway, when and how it's supposed to happen in somebody's life.
Absolutely. That's good. That's so good. Man, I hope people are still listening to this in 7 years. That'd be awesome.
Maybe.
Hopefully I'll do this until I'm dead, so I'll keep it up. So that'll be awesome. That'd be awesome. Man, Welty, I don't want to stop talking. I could talk to you for hours and I'll never get bored of it. So we just got to make sure we stay in touch after this, I guess.
All righty.
But one of the running jokes that I started when I started this podcast was I never knew how to end them. And I just got really awkward with my guest, and I was like, do you have an idea of how we should end this?
Yeah.
And he suggested that we just end with a high five. So
okay,
let's count down. What's the number between 1 and 10 that you want to count down from?
So, how are we going to do that? Because we're not physically in the same space.
So that's the trick. So
okay,
either we can high five, go up on the screen and you go down on the screen, or you go left and I'll go right, or we can just high five the screen and whatever that looks like. So
I always say try and high five the screen because I'm trying to get my brain around how it would work other than that.
Okay.
So, okay.
It looks ridiculous either way, but I keep doing it because I think
all right.
Funny, so.
I mean, just for some context, right? You saying that you never know how to end these? Well, you know what? J.J. Abrams, the celebrity, he's openly talked about how he's not good at endings either. So I think you're in good company, Mitch. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel right at home then.
There you go.
That's perfect. Well, let's count down from 3, and then we'll
okay.
high five the screen, all right?
Yep.
1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's Infinite Story. If it resonated with you, send it to someone you think would be blessed by it. If you would like to share your story, please reach out to us at infiniteideas.studio. You never know how far the impact of your story can reach. Take care now.